The coffee was still warm. On the morning of September 14, 1993, in the ranching community of Wilcox, Arizona, population 3,200, Karen Pruitt's next-door neighbor had spoken to her through the chain-link fence between their yards at 7:10. Karen had been watering her rose bushes, the peace roses she'd planted the spring her youngest started kindergarten, and she'd laughed at something her neighbor said before heading inside to get her purse. She was a third-grade teacher at Cochise Elementary. She had a classroom full of 8-year-olds expecting her by 8 o'clock. She walked through her front door and never came out. What happened in the next 3 hours would haunt Wilcox, Arizona, for the next 31 years. And the man responsible would stand in his neighbor's driveway, helping organize the search party for every one of those years, until a retired detective named Ray Soto opened the wrong box in his garage on a rainy Tuesday in February of 2024. But before we get to that, you have to understand who Karen Pruitt was. Because to understand what was lost on that September morning, you first have to understand the life that was taken from her. Wilcox sits in the Sulphur Springs Valley at the eastern edge of Cochise County, in a part of Arizona where the summers bake the earth to red clay and the winter mornings arrive cold and clear and sharp as glass. In 1993, it was the kind of place where people left their screen doors unlocked on summer evenings, and where the high school football games drew the whole town out of their houses. The main street had a hardware store, a diner called Vera's, and a feed supply that had been run by the same family since 1954. Ranch work and school teaching. Those were the two things that kept a small community like this one alive. Karen Pruitt did one of them. She was 41 years old that September. She'd taught third grade at Cochise Elementary for 14 years, long enough that some of her former students were now bringing their own children to her classroom door. She drove the same blue Chevy Blazer she'd had since 1988. She coached the Junior Bible Bowl team at Grace Lutheran. Every Thursday evening, she had supper at her mother's house on Maricopa Street. And she always called her sister in Tucson on Sunday mornings. She kept a garden because she said it was the only thing that made her feel patient. Those peace roses were named for a reason. Her daughter, Lindsay, was 16 in 1993. Her son, Marcus, was 12. Karen had been raising them alone since her husband, Don, died of a heart attack in 1990. 3 years that had not been easy, but 3 years in which the community around her had held her up the way small towns will. Her colleague, Donna Mercer, would later say, in an interview with the Wilcox Range News, that Karen never complained. Not once. She'd carry the grief home and leave it at the door, and when she walked into that classroom, she was fully present for those children. That was Karen. That was who she was. On the evening of September 13th, she'd helped Marcus with a geography project at the kitchen table while Lindsay was at volleyball practice. She'd folded a load of laundry. She'd watched the 9 o'clock news. The next morning, she watered her roses, laughed with her neighbor over the fence, and went inside. That was the last ordinary morning of her life. At 8:22 a.m., Karen's classroom aide, Dolores Reyes, called the school office to say that Mrs. Pruitt hadn't arrived. The principal, Howard Briggs, noted this as unusual. In 14 years, Karen Pruitt had never been late without calling ahead. By 8:45, he phoned Karen's home. No answer. At 9:10, he called Karen's mother, Ruth, who lived 12 minutes away. Ruth drove to the house immediately. She found the front door unlocked. Karen's purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys were hanging on the hook by the door. The Blazer was in the driveway. The coffee maker was still on. Karen was not there. Ruth called the Cochise County Sheriff's Office at 9:34 a.m. Deputies arrived within 20 minutes. They noted the unlocked front door. the purse and keys, the coffee still warm in the pot. No sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle inside the house. One of the rear windows had been left open. Karen often left it cracked overnight in September before the heat broke, and the screen had been pushed inward. But it was an old screen, and deputies noted it could have been dislodged by wind. That determination would cost them everything. By noon, the search had expanded to the surrounding roads and the open land east of the subdivision. By 3 in the afternoon, Karen's neighbor, Dale Whitman, had organized a group of 30 volunteers in the church parking lot. He knew Karen well. They'd been neighbors for 11 years. He knew her children. He said that morning he would not rest until she was found. Records show he was one of the most active volunteers in those first 72 hours, methodically walking the washes and ridgelines east of town with a group from Grace Lutheran. 3 days into the search, on September 17th, a deputy found a single turquoise earring in the dirt at the edge of a dry wash 8 miles south of town, near the junction of State Route 186. The earring matched a pair Karen's sister identified from a photograph. It was bagged as evidence. The wash was searched. Nothing else was recovered. Karen Pruitt had not been found. The lead investigator assigned to the case was Cochise County Sheriff's Detective Marlene Huss, 38 years old at the time, 10 years into her career, and, by the accounts of those who worked alongside her, the most methodical person in the building. She kept a card file on every person interviewed, color-coded by interview date and connection to the victim. She wrote her case notes by hand. She told her partner at the time that she felt certain from the second day that this was not a voluntary disappearance. The coffee maker was on. A woman leaving voluntarily takes her purse. The sheriff's office was not as certain. The official position for the first several weeks was that Karen Pruitt had left of her own accord, possibly in the grip of grief or mental distress following the death of her husband 3 years prior. This conclusion sat badly with everyone who knew her. Ruth, Karen's mother, went to the county building in person and told the sheriff directly that her daughter had never shown any sign of wanting to leave her children. Lindsay was 16, Marcus was 12. Karen would not leave those children. Detective Huss interviewed 31 people in the first month. She investigated a former coworker who had made Karen uncomfortable at a school function in 1992. He had an alibi, confirmed by 2 witnesses and a gas station receipt from Tucson, 85 miles away. She looked at a man who had twice asked Karen out after her husband's death and had not accepted her refusals gracefully. He was interviewed 3 times. He passed a polygraph. His whereabouts on the morning of September 14th were accounted for. By the end of October 1993, the official investigation had stalled. The screen window, the earring in the wash, a coffee maker left on. These were the fragments of a case that had no body, no confirmed crime scene, and no cooperating evidence of who had done this. The file stayed open. Detective Huss kept her card file current. But the resources moved elsewhere, the way resources always do. Karen's children went to school each day. Lindsay drove herself to volleyball practice. Marcus slept with his bedroom light on. Ruth kept the porch light burning at her own house, every night, the way she always had when Karen was a teenager and needed to find her way home. By 1997, 4 years had passed. The Wilcox Range News ran a brief item on the anniversary. By the year 2000, the story had settled into the category of things the town carried without speaking of directly. One of those open wounds that communities learn to live around. Karen's daughter Lindsay graduated high school in 1995 and left for the University of Arizona in Tucson. Marcus followed her in 1999. Ruth still lived on Maricopa Street. She still kept the porch light on. She still called Detective Huss, now moved into a different assignment, every September 14th. Karen's neighbor Dale Whitman still lived in the house next door to Karen's. He mowed the lawn of the vacant property occasionally, he told people, because it wasn't right to let it go to ruin. He seemed, by all accounts, a steady and decent presence on that street. He attended Grace Lutheran. He served on the county road committee. He had never married. People respected him. A few people, mostly newcomers to the street who didn't know the history, said it was good to have a neighbor who watched out for things. The years accumulated. 2003, 2007, 2011. By then, Detective Huss had retired. She kept her case notes in a binder on the shelf of her home office in Sierra Vista, 35 miles south of Wilcox. Every September, she opened it and read through it again. She never stopped believing there was something she'd missed. She wrote in a journal, which her husband later shared with the Tucson newspaper, that the Pruitt case was the one case she could not put down. She had a feeling about it that she couldn't name, a wrong note she couldn't locate. In 2013, Marcus Pruitt, now living in Phoenix, submitted a missing person DINA profile for his mother to the national database. The submission was routine. The case was cold. The body had never been found. But the record was updated. The file stayed active. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that deserved better. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get back to Karen. It was raining in February 2024 when Ray Soto opened the storage box in his garage in Wilcox. Ray had been a junior deputy in 1993, assigned to the Pruitt search for its first week, before he was pulled back to patrol. He'd retired in 2019 after 30 years with the sheriff's office. He'd been meaning to sort through his old work boxes for a year. On that particular February morning, with the rain coming off the Dos Cabezas Mountains and nothing else requiring his attention, he finally pulled the first box off the shelf. It was not the case file. He didn't have one of those. What it was his personal notebook from 1993. His field notes from the search, written in his own hand in the cramped shorthand he'd used his whole career. He flipped through it for 20 minutes, reading things he hadn't thought about in 30 years, until he reached a page from September 16, 1993, 2 days into the search. He'd written a note about the volunteer group organized by Dale Whitman. He'd written the names of the volunteers. And at the bottom of that page, in his own handwriting, was a line he couldn't explain, having written, "Do. No gloves, East Wash, ask again." He stared at that line for a long time. He had no memory of writing it. He didn't know what it meant. But he knew that volunteers are almost always told to wear gloves when handling any objects in a search zone, and he'd apparently noted that Dale Whitman had not been wearing them. And he'd apparently thought that was worth asking about again, and apparently never had. He called the Cochise County Sheriff's Office that afternoon. He spoke to a detective named Pena who ran cold cases. He read him the note. Detective Pena requested the full case file from archive storage. The process that followed took 8 months. Forensic genealogy, the same technique used in the Golden State Killer case, which works by uploading an unknown DINA profile to public ancestry databases and tracing shared genetic relatives back to identify the unknown contributor, was applied to trace evidence lifted from the open window screen in 1993. The sample had been preserved in an evidence locker for 31 years, cataloged and stored because Detective Huss had logged it as potentially significant in her original case notes, even when no one else agreed with her. The genealogy results came back in October 2024. The DNA from the window screen traced to a family cluster. The cluster pointed to one household in Cochise County. One address. One name. Dale Whitman. He was 72 years old by the time they came to arrest him. He had lived next door to the house where Karen Pruitt had been killed for 31 years. He had helped organize the search party. He had mowed her lawn. He had spoken at the community vigils in 1993 and 1994. Investigators would later establish that Dale Whitman had grown up in Wilcox, that he and Karen had known each other casually for years, and that in the spring of 1993, records show, Karen had spoken to a coworker about a neighbor who had been entering her yard without permission and had made her feel watched. She had not gone to the police. It was 1993 in a small town. He was a fixture. She didn't want to cause trouble. The arrest took place on a Thursday morning in November 2024. Deputies with the Cochise County Sheriff's Office came to his door at 6:45 a.m. Whitman said nothing when they read him his rights. A neighbor 2 houses down, a retired schoolteacher named Barbara Yost, saw the patrol cars and stood on her porch watching. She had known Dale Whitman for 30 years. She later told the Tucson newspaper that she had never once suspected him. Not once in 30 years. She said she kept thinking about Karen's roses, which had long since grown over and died. She said she thought about them for a long time after the cars drove away. Dale Whitman was charged with first-degree murder. He was held without bail. Court documents confirmed that additional trace evidence found during the search of his property in November 2024 corroborated the genealogy findings. In March 2025, he entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He never offered an explanation. He never said her name. Karen Pruitt would have been 72 years old this year. She would have been the age of the man who took everything from her: her mourning, her roses, her children's childhood, her mother's remaining years. She would have been a grandmother, most likely. Lindsay has 2 daughters now. Marcus has a son he named Kevin, after Karen's late father. Ruth, Karen's mother, died in 2011, 13 years before the arrest, having kept that porch light burning until she could no longer tend it. She never got her answer. Lindsay Pruitt, Lindsay Visquez, now, was in Phoenix when Detective Pena called her in October 2024. She later wrote about that phone call in a Facebook post that was shared several thousand times. She wrote that she sat down on the kitchen floor after she hung up and stayed there for a long time. She wrote that she was not surprised. She wrote that she had always believed someone in that town knew. She wrote that she was grateful, and that it was not enough, and that she understood now that it would never be enough, but that it was what there was, and she would take it. Marcus drove from Phoenix to Wilcox the week after the arrest. He went to the house where he grew up. The current owners, a young family who had bought it in 2008, let him walk the backyard. He stood for a while in the spot where his mother's rose garden had been. He told a reporter later that he hadn't planned to cry. He hadn't cried in years, but standing there, he thought about that morning, the last ordinary morning, and the roses she'd been watering, and the neighbor who'd laughed with her through the fence, and all the mornings after that she never had. And he cried. What does it mean that a man can commit an act like this and then spend 31 years in plain sight, attended church suppers, served on community committees, mowed his neighbor's lawn? What does it mean for the small towns we think we know, the places we imagine to be safe because they are familiar? And what would Detective Marlene Huss, who kept her binder on that shelf in Sierra Vista, who called every September, who wrote in her journal that there was a wrong note she could never locate, What would she make of knowing that the note she couldn't locate was in Ray Soto's old field notebook all along, waiting 31 years for someone to open the box? Justice found Karen Pruitt after 31 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More cases are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.